Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to the last session of Baku Global Forum. Thank you very much for coming, for your patience. And today we have an excellent discussion on alliances, the future of alliances, and the motivation behind the alliances. And I will show 3 tools of Moderator. The first one is microphone. The second one is a pen, and I will rise up the pen after 5 minutes expire. And of course, I have a smartphone with a clock. So I try to do my best, and I'll introduce all the distinguished speakers when I give them the floor. But we look at the history of alliances. It goes back to the situation described in the Bible, you know, when Simon and Judah signed alliances against Canaanites. So the history of alliances is as ancient as all the humanity. But let's not go so far back. I'll just try to give some kickoff about the last century. Between the wars, there was a trend to sign non-aggressive pacts. And most of these non-aggressive pacts failed in a few years when the Second World War started. And the most prominent of these pacts is the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact between Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. So after the devastating war, there was a tendency that many military alliances were created all over the world, very different, and also different types of international institutions trying to avoid war and to preserve peace. Many of these alliances have disappeared. Many have turned out to be very sustainable, and the best example is NATO. But some of the alliances have been created even in this century. Some of them are permanent, some are sustainable, but some are just declarative. If we compare at least the economic alliance of European Union, then you see how strong integration there is. The United Kingdom has tried for 2 years, working hard, and can't pull out because so strong is the alliance. And on the opposite, we have, let's say, the Commonwealth and independent states, when Georgia withdrew just in 1 day, writing a declaration, we are going out. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for the future of alliances, and that's the topic of our panel. And first, I would like to give the floor to former President of Georgia, Georgi Margvashvili. And my question will be very simple. You know, Georgia is looking forward to join EU and NATO. At the same time, the neighboring country, Armenia, is trying to fix another option, that's a collective security organization and Eurasian Union. So you are neighbors. What is behind your choices as Georgians?
Thank you, Valdis. I will try to be as precise as I can be and fit into the 5 minutes. First of all, absolutely, Georgia has a very clear choice of where we are heading to and what are the alliances that we want to be part of. And those 2 clear choices are EU and NATO. And we are basically in a process where in the groups that we move in this direction, we have a very positive agenda. We are leaders in this group of integration. And I can say about the EU that we have a very positive agenda because every year we reach another step on EU integration and we get another bounty of integrating into Europe, as well as reform ourselves and make Georgia more European. With NATO, I would not be that positive because this is 17 years that we applied to NATO. It is 11 years that NATO has committed for Georgia's membership. We are a country that is basically providing all NATO standards with 2% of GDP for army and reforming our military, as well as being the biggest per capita participant in NATO Resolute Support Mission. Still, the membership has not been brought as a fact to Georgia. And with NATO, there's something that I want to share concerning this alliance, is that, well, NATO is an alliance that was formed, as we all remember, the people that we come from Soviet Union, as a counterbalance to bipolar world, and there was the Warsaw Pact, which collapsed some 30 years ago. And NATO and the countries that were in NATO and the West has strongly benefited from the peaceful resolution of the Cold War. We can look at Europe, we can look at America, their security, their stability, their standards of life has only increased since then. But we are in a very strange situation when we are talking about the alliances and the moral behind the alliances that we are developing. Today, we hear more and more about undecisiveness within the ideological, or you would say, sort of moral background behind the alliances. We hear, even here, during these days, we heard about multipolarism as a solution to the new world order. And we are talking about this, and after the 30th year of the success of ending the Cold War, and after all the benefits that the winning part has got, and the question marks in this respect, for me, they are very strange and ununderstandable. Why do we question the victory of NATO, the victory of the Western world, and while not taking the benefits and not taking completely the responsibilities of a winner, are we creating further gaps which will be filled by unpredictable policies? Today, we are in a 5th year of an illegal referendum in Crimea. 5 years ago, there was a illegal referendum in Crimea, which basically brought the annexation of the part of our neighboring and friendly Ukraine. 3 days ago, my compatriot, Kvaratskhelia, a young man, was murdered, tortured and murdered in Russian military base, and his corpse has been given to his family just yesterday. So when we are talking about different theories and not taking responsibility for for this victory that has happened, we are talking probably about these kind of calamities that could happen in Georgia, in Ukraine, in other parts of the world. And we are talking about the future of maybe of a disaster of millions of people who should benefit from a more stable order and through more active role of NATO. Your question about why we are going in this direction, it's very obvious. First, we have the values that we share with the EU and NATO, but not only that we are committed to these values. We have several geopolitical determinations why we want to be in those alliances. First is that Georgia is a country that is providing a transit economic solutions to East and West, and that format is in a way in competition to the alliances that is controlled by Russia. Second, Georgia is a solution on Black Sea, and we have our own vision on Black Sea, and we try to make this vision more active in NATO. Third, Georgia is a unique place which has free trade with China and EU, and that's also our advantage, which is in a competition to other alliances. And finally, you mentioned us joining CIS and leaving CIS practically instantly. What was the reason? Because in the alliances that we try to become member of, whether it's EU or NATO, we find benefits. And they are built around the benefits of the members. While the other alliances in which we were forced to be, whether it was Warsaw Pact, whether it was Soviet Union, whether it was CIS, the reason why we were there was not the benefit, but that was that we were forced to be in that alliance. I think I fit within the schedule. I tried to make it short. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Now we have to go to another alliance which was created in 21st century. It's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I give the floor to Chinese intellectual and very important person now, Professor Pan. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, everyone. Good afternoon. There's the last session, but not the least. And so I come from China, from Tsinghua University. And I just want to see there's we call the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, based on Mr. Chairman's question. And you know, in the past 2 days, a lot of friends asked me what I'm going to talk. I said talking about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and they said, "What's that?" So I thought, okay, so that's very in China is kind of the popular, but I don't think it's popular here. And so SCO, China Shanghai Cooperation Organization, founded 2001, just 18 years ago. The beginning original purpose is to anti-terrorism, but today it's changed a lot. Now we have 8 members, we have 4 observers, and 6 we call the dialogue partners. I prefer call this is cooperation organization rather than alliances, because you know there's it's not only there's a military, it's not military alliances, it's not political alliances, it's focus on the common interests. So we focus on in the past, we focus on economics and also the mutual benefit and development. So you can see the members. There's India and Pakistan. So now India and Pakistan, they still have some confrontation in their borders in the Kashmir. But they are in same members. They are the members, the 2 of 8 members. And also we have Azerbaijan and Armenia. So what that means? That means even they have some kind of issues to be solved, but they can sit down together in that organization. So that organization truly, really try to solve the issues and the problems in the past 18 years. So that's a original mission and today's situation. In the future, I think there are 3 areas that's SCO will focus. The first one is economic collaboration. You know, that's the countries covered almost 50% of the land of the earth. That's the organization the countries covered. And also over 50% of people covered by this organization. And the GDP is only 20%. So we have a lot of potentials to do in this, under this organization in this 18 countries. So that's the number 1, economic development. The second is technologic cooperation. You know, now in China we develop a lot of biotechnology and the communication technology, and also the other countries, they have their advantage, like the oil industries technologies, and also there's like Russian, they have aerospace technologies. Each country has their own specialties. So we try to collaborate in the technology field. So that's in China, try to use 5G for the phone, for the cell phone, for the communication. And that's a technology is not belong to China, they belong to whole the world. So we try to implement everything like this, develop technology. China in the past years, they invest a lot of money in the technology development. Even we have a lot of controversial issues with the US today, but indeed China did a lot on this, but we try to collaborate with other countries. The third is people to people. So I come from university and we have education field, and we have a lot of students, and the Schwarzman College I work now is try to bring the young leaders like this morning's session and to the future. You know, today, you know, there's like Mr. Chairman said, in the past, from the World I, World II, World II, whatever, there's a lot of conflictions or confrontations. So that's based on the confrontation. But now in the future is the peace. We focus on the peace and the development. So for that, you know, the young leaders, the future leaders, so important for our the university and for our teachers and for everyone here. And a lot of Your Excellency sit here is our professors and also our mentors for our young future leaders. So that's a people-to-people collaboration and exchange program. We started a lot, and we try to continue to do that under this organization. So hopefully we have a very bright future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So we are on our way from military alliances to cooperative alliances, and we have a representative of cultural alliance, science alliance, and education alliance. And we have Arab League, we have Islamic military alliance, but we also have Islamic education, science, and cultural organization, and it is represented by Abdulaziz Altwaijri. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me first to express my gratitude to the Nizami Ganjavi Center, International Center, for inviting me to this beautiful forum. And at the outset, I would like to, on behalf of ISESCO, to strongly condemn the terrorist attack that targeted 2 mosques in Christchurch yesterday in New Zealand. I believe the heinous terrorist does not represent Australia, nor the Christianity, nor Christianity, nor any human belief or ethics. He made this crime under the drive of his racist beliefs and racist mentality. And this act, heinous act, prompts the need for a collective world work to combat all kinds of xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, whatever, that is now spreading and creating an atmosphere of fear and hatred that divides people. We are talking about alliances and rapprochement. And these criminals and terrorists, whoever they may be, whether they say they are Muslims or Christians or whatever, they do not represent their religions. Terrorism has no religion, has no culture, and has no civilization. It's a criminal act that has to be condemned and to be fought. The alliance that is taking place right now to fight terrorism in the region is under the umbrella of the so-called International Alliance for Combating Terrorism. It is composed of 60 countries led by the United States of America, and many Muslim and Arab countries are members of this alliance. Education, science, and culture are elements of building the minds and the souls of humans and creating bridges, erecting bridges between nations and peoples to know each other and to respect each other and to cooperate for maintaining peace and security in the world. Unfortunately, there are many factors in the world right now which make our job in the field of education, science, and culture very difficult, not only in ISESCO, but in UNESCO and in the Council of Europe and the International Francophonic Organization and many other organizations. We need to work hard on teaching our young generations the culture of peace, the culture of respect for the diversity, religious and cultural diversity. The world is not composed of one unit. We have many religions, many cultures, many civilizations, and many languages, and many races. But we are human beings. We belong to the human family. We have to go back to the origin of our existence and respect each other on this basis. We may believe in different religions and speak different languages and have different backgrounds and different cultural belongingness, but this does not make us hate each other and fight each other and feel, that the other is not our friend or our human fellow person. This is a culture of hatred that should be eradicated from our educational system, from our cultural forums, from our media also. The media is instigating certain kinds of xenophobia and also creating some fear and suspicion of the other. Yes, the world is full of crazy people and people who do not hesitate to harm the other, whatever the other may be. But we have to fight those people, wherever they come from, and whatever they say and raise to deceive people and say that they speak on behalf of this religion or that religion or this culture or that culture. They do not represent their cultures. They do not represent their religions. They represent their ill souls, their ill minds only, because the world in its totality, in its general composition, does not believe in this. We work hard now in the Alliance of Civilization under the UN umbrella, in the cultural organizations like UNESCO and ISESCO and the ISESCO of the Arab League and many other organizations, to spread the spirit of belongingness, of respect of the other, of accepting the other. I don't like the word tolerance. I like to say acceptance. We accept each other as we are. If I tolerate you, that means I deal with you. I don't like you. I don't believe in what you do. But this is not human behavior, human feeling. The real human feeling, the just feeling, is that I accept you and you accept me, and we coexist and work together to make the world peaceful, livable, and clean from all these illnesses that are making us look at each other with suspicion and with some kind of, phobias that make the distances so grand between us, so vast between us. No, we have to bring our nations closer to each other because, first of all, we belong to one family, and that's the human family. If we want to be animals, that's another story. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very valuable remarks. But we have the most representative alliance of the globe. That's United Nations. Practically all states are the member states of United Nations. And we have a very distinguished speaker, David Chikvaidze, and he has the experience of being there so long. And my question would be, can you tell me what's changing in the United Nations after the end of the Cold War? Because when I was a kid, I remember the blue helmets everywhere as peacekeepers, UN very active was peacekeeping operations. After the fall of Berlin Wall and after the end of Cold War, we don't see this as an effective tool. Why?
Thank you, Mr. President. President in more ways than one. Let me begin by thanking President Ilham Aliyev for his foresight in creating the Nizami Ganjavi Center and turning it under his purview and guidance into a prominent platform where theoretical knowledge and high-level political experience come together to discuss issues of our current world. Indeed, the impressive list of participants is testament to the geopolitical role and convening power of Azerbaijan, and of the respect that President Aliyev commands among his peers. To address your question on the subject of our panel, let me very quickly refer to some definitions. Alliances form in many areas, among them economic, political, as you mentioned. But the most immediate association, obviously, especially when the word alliance is spelled with a capital A, is military alliances. Alliances denoted those fighting in World War I against the Central Powers and in World War II against the Axis powers. perhaps a meaningful difference between alliance and its broader synonymic partner, as in association or partnership, is that alliances inherently require an obligation to come to the aid of other members. Hence the famous quote by Thomas Jefferson, "Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none." The same sentiment is echoed in a speech by John F. Kennedy on the U.S. relationship with Canada, where he said, "Geography has made us neighbors, history has made us friends, economics has made us partners, and necessity has made us allies." Now, alliances, do they deter conflict? One would say that in the pre-nuclear and nuclear age, yes. In the post-nuclear age, although nuclear weapons are very present, the jury is still out, and mercifully so. Very importantly, do the alliances require an antagonist? Because of their military association, alliances generally need an antagonist. What else, the argument goes, would motivate anyone to form an alliance with somebody else? Following this line, the UN itself can be described as an alliance, cannot be described as an alliance given its universal membership. On the other hand, if we define antagonist as global challenges, then the United Nations could, of course, and indeed should, be seen as the best alliance we have to act in concert to advance our mutual interests. And this alliance has a terrific global roadmap. It's the Sustainable Development Goals that the member states themselves have adopted, and Agenda 2030. This argument gains currency, especially in our current situation where we're talking about multipolarity, but we're not even sure where we're going. We're just extrapolating from bipolar to probably multipolar. We're not there yet. We don't know where we're going. But the UN in this situation could be the truly neutral table and the truly global alliance. But that's very problematic in our day and age because the key relationship between the largest players, the United States, Russia, and China, has probably never been as dysfunctional as now. A lot of the reasons for this dysfunction have been touched upon in these past 3.5 days, but one only had a cursory passing mention, which is nuclear weapons. And that is becoming a key problem. And the UN is front and center. You said how things change for the UN. The UN seemed to have achieved many more things before the fall of the bipolar world than it is now. And, you know, for those of us who work in the Secretariat, we're hopeful that perhaps now that Russia has returned to its place in Western minds of being the boogeyman, maybe the United Nations, which for a certain period of time in the early 90s was accorded that role in the absence of the boogeyman, maybe now the UN can be used by its member states for what they created it, to be a place where problems that they cannot solve outside on a bilateral manner can be brought in and solved in the confines of the UN. However, that is not happening, and what we're facing is a severe politicization of everything that the UN machinery represents, primarily the Security Council, the Human Rights Council, and the member states. Instead of resolving issues, they bring their outside street fights inside the chambers, and they continue it there. So much so that we can't even talk about the P5 anymore. We talk about the P3 and the P2, and they don't resolve problems. They score points against each other. And one last thing, and I can talk about the disarmament afterwards if it's of interest. In conclusion, let me just make one simple but stark general point. If we are indeed in search of a new foreign policy, if yesterday's tools and mindsets are not able to resolve today's problems, they are downright useless for future problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So now I want to introduce Antonio Zanardilandi, a very experienced diplomat, served in different parts of the world. I just mentioned Canada, Iran, Russia, and he was advisor to President of Italy. I would like to hear your point of view from different angles, from your experience. What is the role of alliances?
The role of alliances can be twofold, or to make a war or to prevent a war. And obviously we hope that alliances which will form in the next years will be meant to prevent wars and not to make wars. But today we are passing through a phases which I would define melting phase, in the sense that all international institutions created last century, and in particular after the Second World War, show profound signs of crisis. Every international organization, United Nations, had some shortcomings in recent years. WTO is under a very severe pressure. The European Union, no need to talk about that. The all-arm limitation treaty system is in shambles, in fact. So also military alliances are passing through a crisis at the moment. Certainly the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a very important one, even though, as Professor Pan said, is changing its scope, has been changing widely its scope, and is not for us clear enough where the cooperation is going to go. Because last year or 2 years ago, India and Pakistan have been admitted, which was a very positive thing and a very probably conducive, helping the peace in that part of the world. But I think that also Iran is a permanent observer waiting for admission. So for us, it's still not 100% clear where the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is going to go. In fact, there is only one military alliance in the world which is alive and kicking at the moment, which is NATO, even though it's a very different NATO from the one we used to know. And is a NATO which has some existential problems because President Trump, who is the president of the leader nation, has said something very severe about NATO, particularly at the beginning of his mandate. But evidently, this feeling of criticism is still very much present because the US Congress passed a law in January forbidding the president to withdraw unilaterally from NATO. That is, for me, a sign of quite a serious crisis. So before we recognize NATO as a very positive factor, as a factor of stability, and we recognize the fact that NATO is not only a military alliance, but has also a system of values built in itself. So it's something which is very, very precious, but I think we have to be aware that there is a crisis looming over that too. The Warsaw Pact doesn't exist any longer, and many other cooperations or alliances have disappeared or are paralyzed, as you know. And what we see coming to the light now is a system of informal, temporary alliance, which, once again, we do not understand very well. For example, China and Russia are not formally allied, but this year they had the major war games in the history of humanity. The military games carried forward this year involved 300,000 soldiers and more than 50,000 armored vehicles. That is not an alliance, but is something which resembles very much to an alliance. And I think we have to try to follow and to try to understand as better as we can. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and even Israel are working much more closely today, but mostly with the purpose of containing Iran. It's certainly not a formal alliance, but there is something in it. And so for Russia, Turkey, and Iran, as far as Syria is concerned, there is a very in-depth cooperation. What I'm noticing is that these kind of new alliances are lacking a fundamental glue, which is ideology, which is common values. And that is a challenge for us, a challenge to better understand and try to figure out where we are today.
Thank you very much. And of course, we will face some problems in the future, and most experienced politicians try to foresee these problems, and they also need at least to have some vision, you know. Do we need some alliances to face these problems, to tackle these problems? And now I give the floor to Herman de Croo, a very experienced Belgian politician, his view on alliances and possible threats.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be back here. The Baku global fora are interesting because they allow us to be critical on existing structures, but also to try to think on future structures. And I would start to give you some figures and then go back to the problem I would like to pose to you. 2,000 years ago, humanity was counting 100 million men and women, 100 million, with, I would say, a coefficient of 10 for each of them in their necessities. 2,000 years later, we are going to be above the 7 billion, and each of those 7 billion women and men have perhaps a coefficient of need of 1,000. You see the impact between those 2,000 years. In Africa, at the end of the 18th century, in Central Africa, 100 million people lives. Today, we are going to reach 2.5 billion. And if you look to the comparison in Africa, there was a future 2.5 billion with the average age of 18 or 19 years, will be in front, I would say, on the other side of a small group of white people, 500 million, Europe and at large, with the average age of 51 years. And it was told to us in the debates we had the last days that the world is flat. Not only the world is flat, but people is going to move on those flat earth. And what I foresee and what I'm thinking that we have to be attentive is that you will have in the coming decennia, permanent flow of migration. It will be migration due to the importance of population. I make you the comparison to the misery of populations. Average income is $1 to $2 a day for a family in Africa, Central Africa. On the climate impact on migration, there will be a big, I would say, disturbance we will undergo. It is not new. Europe was in the 19th century moving out to the North and South America. 63 million people of Europe were moving from Europe to the two Americas. 41 million to North America, 12 million to Brazil, some hundreds of thousands even to South Africa. And we feel that migration is something you have to think about and to prepare. If you have interest in one of the good books about this problem, try to read a French book called La Ruée vers l'Europe, Rush to Europe, by Stephen Smith. It was published last year as one of the best geopolitical books of that year. And you will see that this movement will be inescapable, inevitable. We can deal with existing alliances, United Nations, Europe, African Union, but at a given moment it will be a structural problem. And when does this migration start? Not yet now. I don't speak about the drama, which is openly from short term in the Middle East. People start to move not when they are at the poorest level, but when they get a little bit richer. So the migration for Africa has still to start. And it will be a migration of millions, of tens of millions. It can change the political face of our regimes. It can be utilized by populism, of which we have spoken the last days, but it will be a real problem. We can foresee it or we can undergo it. We can do it with small impacts, agreements between Europe and Turkey, where in fact we pay money to keep people there, agreements with different powers in Libya, where we pay money to keep people there. But structurally speaking, when you have a 2.5 billion black people in the center of Africa, with the age of 18 or 19, vis-à-vis half a billion of people living in the West with the average age of 51, there will be a huge movement of people. If we don't foresee, if we don't utilize existing alliances, or if we don't create new ones, it could be an extraordinary civilization drama. And I believe that thinking positively to what is going to come, it would be interesting to see, is there reflection, is there coordinations, is there room to think about those structures, and a lot of solutions can be proposed, but I would be very happy to see all my colleagues and others, so the people of the room will react to that idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to former President of Ukraine, Viktor Yushchenko, and he's not only a former president, he's a hero of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And it is an existing conflict, existing military conflict between Ukraine and Russia, present today, while we are sitting in this room. So I would like to ask you, what were the role of different alliances in preventing or not preventing Ukrainian and Russian conflict? And do you see any chance for any alliance to solve this conflict?
Спасибо за слово.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would like to start my short presentation with the following, story. You need to remind yourself of the political concept that we had in Europe. So we have the Second World War ending. There are agreement on the capitulation, and the next day you see the world basically emerge itself into a new front of Cold War erupting. Mr. Churchill used to say back then, there's from the Baltic Sea to Adriatic Sea in Europe, there's a wide, high iron curtain, which in fact broke down the world into two parts: European, democratic, you can call it Western civilizations that enjoys freedom, that enhances democracy and respects it, and the Eastern, Siberian part, feudal part, medieval part, which doesn't love freedom, neither democracy, and for many years to go further, this will be the key conflict, the key antagonist in this area where we are living. At the same time, 30 years pass from the conflict. We sign Helsinki's final act, which allows us to build security, the basic foundation. In 15 years' time, we sign a Paris Charter, an interesting document, a quite romantic piece of paper that I would call with key things of the security matters for the entire Euro. Let me read an extract from this document on how we were thinking 30 years ago, for instance. We, the states, participate and gather here in Paris in difficult challenges and historical expectations. The era of confrontation and division of Europe has ended. I want you to focus on this. We declare that our relations will be based on mutual respect and cooperation, since now the Europe is freed from heritage of the past, great words. Now, today's time is a time to implement all the expectations and hopes that we had in the hearts of our nations for decades. This is a robust commitment to democracy and security for all our nations. And now I would like to try to teach a lesson. What has happened to us in this past 30 years, specifically in Eastern Europe? And I witness and I testify that in the past 30 years in Europe, we had 6 military conflicts. We are talking about Eastern Europe now. The conflicts, even now, are present. It's painful to hear this or not, but I would like to say in each of these conflicts, the aggression comes from Moscow. The occupation of all 6 territories is carried out by Russia. I'm talking about Nagorno-Karabakh, South Ossetia, Transnistria, Donbass, Crimea. Whether you want to admit it or not, but to me it seems like we are living in the times of surrealist, some periods of October of 1938, when with Führers there were many people going to see him. He was being pleased and satisfied, and they forgave him the annexation. He carried out referendums and had gifts of the lands. This was all accepted by the great Europe. So in the end, to wave him with about 2 or 3 pieces of paper and to the British people, saying that after all of these betrayals, I came with peace to you. We took the war issue from the agenda. In fact, we came to this moment of waging a war, and we paid the price, the highest price we could pay as humanity. Therefore, today, as a part of the lesson, I would like to say that with us, with the Europeans, in the European continent, we don't have peace. In these 27 years, we haven't learned the lesson to regulate none of the conflicts that started 30 years ago, or in Georgia 11 years ago, or in Ukraine 5 years ago. We don't have a tool or a mechanism to adequately react to the challenges of the policy that causes these conflicts. Second, at the moment we haven't fulfilled any resolution of the Security Council of the UN in none of the conflicts. We haven't fulfilled the General Assembly resolutions about this conflict. Therefore, what is our guiding mechanism? What's a reference point? How do we build our lives around that? One thing which we understood very well, I believe, with this kind of position, Russia sets up its neo-imperial policy, enhances the threats, and we continue to behave inadequately. Second, think of this. In the course of the 30 years, 4 states in Europe has lost territorial integrity. Imagine this, in 4 countries of Europe, we don't have political sovereignty in place. It's a time, right? Yes? This is half, a part of what I wanted to say. This also implies that the fundamental, basic principle to shape the world order and the recognition of territorial integrity as a principle, we have lost that already. And maybe the last point, or the penultimate point, if I may. In 1994, Ukraine, the political leadership of Ukraine, thought that we are contributing massively to the world order. We said no to nuclear armament voluntarily, and we have received a guarantee for territorial integrity and political sovereignty. Now we lost 7% of our territory, 60,000 wounded and killed people. I have a question to ask. Where are our warrants? United States, Russia, China, UK, France. Where are these parties that guaranteed this? Because we made our part of the deal, and it's also a relationship towards the entire humanity. And the last comment from my side. I'm curious, do these states, do these European leaders, 2-3 of them, when in 2008 in my country or in Ukraine, we didn't have this right to join to NATO, to join the other union. They thought that in 3 months the Russian forces entered the Georgian area. They believe they are guilty of that. They think that in 5 years' time the same forces come to enter Ukraine. And I am confident that the force of the alliance is in its solidarity. This is an arm that you cannot shoot against. If in Ukraine and in Georgia, something that an alliance would do in that particular case, if this would happen, then I think we wouldn't have 4 military conflicts in Europe. One of them is a remaining conflict. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. So we have finished the first round of statements, and I'll try to have some summary. What were the messages? The alliances, I'm speaking about permanent alliances, today are created to prevent the war, not to start the war. At the same time, I'm not agreed fully, because some of alliances are made to start or to at least participate in the war. And we have come to the point that also alliances are created to prevent terrorism and in common interests, economic interests, and advancement of technology and economic cooperation. So today's alliances, we have to change the definition. It's not only military alliance, it's alliance, also political alliance, economic alliance, for absolutely different goals, because the war is not the only goal to create an alliance. And you see the latest alliance, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, don't speak about military goals at all. So it's alliance of the 21st century. At the same time, you see the geopolitics, geography, and somebody said geology are still relevant criteria about the interests or mutual interests and benefits of different countries. And I heard a very, very clear motivation to join some alliances. It means, values and moral aspects. And then you come, clear step-by-step program of reforms to get to a sum-up level of development. So maybe it's a way we have to go. At the same time, you see that the organizations after the end of bipolar world are not anymore so effective. So we have not adapted to the new situation of multi-players. So maybe, the UN as a whole is a good thing, but we have to do something, or at least to think about how to reform the Security Council. That's what I heard. And I really like this sentence. The alliance is for building minds and creating bridges, and that means cultural diplomacy. And there is a room for cultural diplomacy. So, but the biggest question I have to ask you all, do you really think that every alliance needs an antagonist to be created? I don't think this is a situation in the 21st century. Who is the first who is ready to respond? Just raise your... Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think if we look at the world scene right now, which is governed by the United Nations Charter as an alliance for the whole countries of the world, I see that the construction of this body, especially in the Security Council, is not fair. It does not reflect the weight of the different countries, different continents. The veto right is only given to 5 countries, which means that 5 countries control the whole world. If they like something, they pass it. If they don't like it, they veto it. What about the Islamic world? What about Latin America? What about India and the Southeast Asian region? Some European countries who are very big, like Germany. I mean, this situation has to be tackled seriously to rebuild the United Nations system on fair grounds, on just grounds. The world cannot go on like that, where their destiny is in the hands of a small group of countries, even if they are powerful and they have nuclear powers. But Pakistan also has nuclear power. Iran is about to have it. And some other countries might have it soon. So this is an obstacle that is really making a big problem for the whole world. The second issue, alliances were created since the Westphalia Treaty, going through the different stages until we reach the NATO and the CENTO, and now the Alliance for Fighting Terrorism and the other alliances that are created in the region, and in our region and some other regions. These are made for special purposes. They are not made for real security and peace of the world. It is based on the conflicts and the struggle between the superpowers, between the nations that want to maintain their hegemony on certain parts of the world, and the losers are the human beings in those countries. So let's go back and sit down, ratify these situations, and find a way that maintain peace and security in reality, and keep the rights of all nations preserved, protected, and respected. I go to my domain, science, technology, and science, culture, and technology, and education. Look at the United States and Israel. They withdrew from UNESCO. They politicized UNESCO, while UNESCO is a cultural, educational, and scientific organization. It shouldn't be politicized. They might quarrel in the United Nations, in the Security Council, but not in UNESCO. The same thing now is happening in our Islamic world, in the OIC, in the Islamic Parliamentarian organization, in the Arab League parliamentarian organization. They are not even making the decisions coincide with the purpose of each organization. They are politicizing it for narrow-minded vision and look. I think the struggle between the superpowers is the core and crux of this problem. They have to sit down and solve their problems between themselves and let the world live in peace and prosperity, and not to hate each other and fight each other. And in the final analysis, we find people emigrating by hundreds of thousands to Europe from Africa. Who usurped Africa? The colonizers. Go back and rebuild Africa. You will not find any African going to Europe. Keep them there in their countries. Do not support the dictators who are ruling them. Bring democracy to those countries. Let those countries live in real democracy. You will find no African going to Europe. They will stay in their homes. Nobody loves to leave his country, to leave his mother and father and beloved people. They are forced because they are poor, they live under dictatorship, and the wealth is stolen by the multinational corporations. Thank you, sir.
Very strong statement. Can we respond?
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I think it was inevitable that I would take the floor after this statement, which I actually agree with many of the things in the overall framework into which you put it. However, there are a few things there that I cannot not react to. One, just on the face of it, you said at the outset that the world scene today is governed by the United Nations Charter. I wish it were. You wish it were. It is not. It's governed by something totally different. The other point about the Security Council, I fully agree with you, and I think the entire world agrees that the Charter is a product of 1945. It's a product for a world that came after a tremendous war that wreaked havoc on the entire world. So, and the Charter was a product of the victorious powers. That's why I think a bigger problem than how it's composed, the Security Council is composed, is the fact that we still have the term enemy nations in the Charter. That should be gotten rid of. However, your causal relationship is wrong. You have presented this as being the crux of the problem, why we are where we are today. For a moment, sir, imagine that you've got 30 members of the Security Council with all the countries that you have enumerated and then some, and 15 of them have veto power. Can you imagine that kind of a Security Council being more effective? That's not the reason. The reason is that the powers that have the veto have become, have neglected their duty to negotiate very hard with each other. Negotiation and diplomacy is, you know, I worked for a supreme diplomat for a period, Secretary of State James Baker, when he was in the UN. And he used to tell me, David, if you've got 10 parties around the negotiating table, and 9 of them go back with what they wanted, and only 1 doesn't go back with anything, the negotiations were a failure. Everybody has to, nobody can have everything, but everybody has to have something. And that is what is not being done. Not to belabor Baker, think about 2 episodes. One before the first Iraq War, and the second episode before the second Iraq War. What happened? Even though Baker had a very, very pliant Soviet Union, he still went out of his way to bring around to his position all the other non-voting, non-permanent members, so that he had unanimity, and he spent a lot of time on that very hard diplomacy and horse trading. What happened in 2003? Who was in the Security Council? Who was against the war in Iraq? Was it not? It wasn't Russia. It was Germany and France. The French Foreign Minister, Dominique de Villepin, got a standing ovation, clapping in the Security Council, unheard of. There was only one time before. So that's not the issue. The issue is that the organization that was created by the member states for a particular purpose is not being used. It is being abused. Now, the last point I want to make, or maybe 2 small points. One, you said bring democracy to Africa. Yes, democracy should come to all countries. However, you have to define democracy. Democracy is not elections. Most countries that became independent and so on have elections. However, elections are stolen very often. Democracy cannot be decreed. Democracy has to grow inside a country. And the last thing, superpowers should resolve their problems. Professor Ihsanoglu yesterday was mentioning the Pax Ottomana that ended at the end of the First World War. Pax Britannica ended at the end of, with the end of the Second World War. What we are living through now is Pax Americana. And as President Ashraf Ghani said in the opening, that after the war, Second World War, a very good system was created for part of the world. And now we have to create a system for the entire world. And this is where Pax Americana comes in. The system created after the Second World War, excellent system. We all love it, and we all want to use it, even those that are opposed to it. That is Pax Americana. And what we are living through today is very simply how to make Pax Americana stronger and perpetuate it. But the question is, how do we engage everybody in it? Because the other countries, Russia, China, and other regional players, they want a piece of the action. So somebody has to give up part of that action. Then we will be looking at a different world landscape. And then maybe we'll have multipolarity or whatever we wind up with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have some, yes, I'll give the floor, but we have some very, very nice statements, you know. The Security Council's Big Five neglected duty to negotiate. That's a good statement. And not used, but is abused. So we come to it that veto is not anymore an effective tool because it kills the negotiation process. Good. Now the floor is yours.
I can agree greatly with what was said, but we can think to the future. If you have a problem with climate and a problem with migration, you can give new aims to a world organization called United Nations. I think if we try to solve uniquely the past, which means that we try to redress veto rights and membership and influence, but common problems which are really passing any boundaries of any continent. And I repeat, climate and migration could be new aims, perhaps to rearrange lines and perhaps to modernize the United Nations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And now I would like to little bit change the direction of our discussions. I turn back to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. You defined very nice goals and mentioned that it's very important for India and Pakistan relationship. But then there's a question, when Japan and Korea will become member states of this organization?
Yeah, that's a challenging question. So before I answer that, probably I echo question about Mr. Landy. You know, it's about military game. You know, there's in the past years, China military had a very comfortable life. There's the good life. So they need to do some exercise to lose weight. I think that's why they try to do some military game. So answer the question about Shanghai Cooperation Organization, why the Japan and the South Korea will join or not. So indeed, so they try to do some collaborations with China, and also they try to want to join that. And so answer this question, I want to talk a little bit about the one-by-one road. You know, this year, Japan and China had a diplomacy for 40 years. And for South Korea is around almost 30 years. And so both countries had a very good relationship in economic collaborations in the past years. In the 1980s, in China, the most investment FDI country is Japan, and the second is Korea in the 1990s. So you can see how tight the relationship in economic term. So that's in the past years. Keep going that. In China, you can see a lot of Japanese cars everywhere, and Korea cars in Beijing, all the taxis, the 100,000 taxis made in Korea. So there's a very tight. But why they have not joined that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? I think at the beginning, the original purpose for that ISESCO was focused on the anti-terrorist. So at that time, you know, Japan, Korea, and China, we don't have that issue at all. So even the 70 or 80 years ago, we had a problem, but today we don't have that problem. So that's one reason. A second reason is, you know, all the countries in this ISESCO are developing countries. So whatever the Russia, India, Turkey, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, all the developing countries. But Japan, you know, there's developed countries. There's GDP over $60 per capita, but China, and average in this organization is below 10,000 US dollars. So that's the second reason, I think. So that's probably answer your question, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very perfect explanation. But I still come back to the problem of possible migrants and migration from Africa to Europe. And do we need any organizations? Do we need any alliances? And then I asked just a question. There was an initiative nearly 10 years ago, Alliance for Mediterranean, and before that was the Barcelona process. Why do you think it failed? And should be another attempt to taken?
One of the observations is right, of course. We have a conflict of numbers and a conflict of aspirations. But to make it very simple, if the African populations are not helped to stay where they are, they will move to Europe. I simplify, of course. So the duty is in there, but also in our hands. And I believe that the structures today do not correspond to what we need to do there. It is a new item, is a new objective, where perhaps we can unite efforts to keep a solution. I agree with my colleague. This population doesn't like to move, but the drama is they will start to move when prosperity, very low prosperity, will reach them. Not today. They are too poor to move. That prosperity is coming. And if you don't take that opportunity to keep them there with all the necessity of health and roads, education, aspirations, future, they will come to Europe and understand this. So we have to see, if you don't do that by generosity, let us do that by fear. It will be one of the motives to move our population.
Italian approach?
About something slightly different. Obviously, after having heard what Jeffrey Sachs told us yesterday, you could find a number of issues which could justify a new alliance to fight for the good and for the safety of this planet. But I was thinking that we need a new kind of glue, because our countries, or at least many of our countries, are very much divided in themselves, and they are divided between themselves. And we have not discovered yet an efficient glue to keep them together and to keep people together. Going to alliances, we have changed a system of values with a technical concept which has become prevalent, which is interoperability. Do you know how important is the trade of defense stuff in the world? And many countries, among the biggest producers, have been tempted to sell their equipment at a very high level in order to have forced allies, in the sense that if you sell a certain kind of equipment to country A, this country is in a way forced to stick with you. But this concept, eminently technical, hasn't proved to be too efficient, because we have read of newspapers in the last month that India has bought the S-400s from the Russians, which is a new thing, which creates some problems for the Indo-Pacific concepts our American friends are proposing. And even more dramatic move, a NATO country is buying the S-400 from the Russians. which creates a great problem inside the NATO. So it's clear that interoperability doesn't work. We have to go back to ideas and values in some way. And about that, let me pay a small tribute to the Nizami International Center, because this time they showed the capacity on inviting to this conference some people with a great capacity of viewing the future in a way. I had a whiskey and water with a former New Zealand Prime Minister, Jim Bolger, 2 days ago. And he said, well, one of the big problems of Europe, but also of New Zealand, and I feel it very strongly in New Zealand, is that people are scared by newcomers. And there is a very strong reaction against immigrants. Well, that very night, they had these terrible killings in two mosques. I thought it was quite striking for me. And the second one is the Canadian former Foreign Secretary, Monsieur Dion, who gave to me an injection of optimism. What we have been talking today is a little bit gloomy. I mean, at least from my side, I have the feeling that we are going to confront a number of very difficult years, and that we have to pass through a desert before the world regains a sort of equilibrium. But I saw, speaking with Minister Dion, I had an injection of optimism, and I like to keep that with me when I leave from Baku. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we have some time for injection from the audience, and the floor is yours for the questions, and the panel is ready to answer. Are there any microphones around? Please, you, and after then you. Do you have 2 microphones? Introduce yourself. And
I'm Professor Thomas Reuter, and I'm here as a member of the World Academy of Science. And I thank the organizers for inviting scientists to this meeting. And I must say, though, that from the perspective of science, it's terribly frustrating to see that the primary concerns in the political class is still the pursuit of narrow aims, and there is a failure to see the writing on the wall. And I think if we talk about new diplomacy, what's going to drive that is sheer necessity. And unfortunately, the room emptied when we had the panel on the environmental challenges that we face. And very soon, the pressure to cooperate will be so strong that if we don't, we will perish as a whole, and civilization will break down, and this breakdown will be accelerated by the kind of animosities that still preoccupy our minds as if they really mattered. They do not in the face of these challenges.
thank you, Ange, for your opinion. Please pass the microphone over to Amr Moussa, and please give the microphones there on that left part.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have 3 points to raise. First one, the question you addressed to the panel about the Mediterranean alliances. Nobody answered that question. I thought that our Italian friend or Belgian friend would address this issue, because it was indeed a very important initiative that is nowhere. It brought together the European Union, all the Mediterranean countries, and it was the Barcelona process, and before it, the Mediterranean Club and Mediterranean Forum, and then the French initiative about the Union for the Mediterranean. I believe, and as you believe, that we have to revisit this issue and see what we can do within the Mediterranean, because if we talk about the future of the Middle East, the future of regional security in that vast region, we have to involve the Mediterranean. So it is not only territorial alliances or territorial security, but the security in this huge society of nations, European, Arab, Asian and North Africans. That is the first point. Second point about the Security Council. In fact, it is so difficult to reform the Security Council. And all regions are divided. So when we mentioned Germany, Italy said, no, what about me? So there is a veto within Europe on the candidacy of Germany. So is in China, and you know the story in China. Who are the candidates to join? It is Japan and India. And Japan and India have been also kind of vetoed within Asia itself, and so on and so forth. So it is not that easy to talk about how to reform the Security Council. We have tried that for 20 or 30 years now, and you know that, David. In the United Nations, a lot of initiatives have been put on the table only to be vetoed one after the other, not by the 5 powers that have veto, but by the regional groupings themselves. The third point concerning the word or the term values. Let us get or return back to what kind of values exactly you are talking about. We have seen a lot of violation of those values by those who speak about values when we try to deal with the issue of Libya, for example, or the issue of Syria, for example. So if we talk about values, it is not European values, they have to be global values. We have to contribute to that, as you have to contribute to that, but we don't have to succumb to one interpretation of values coming from a certain direction in the world.
Thank you very much. Please give the microphone over there. I agree with you, but I was present on this President Sarkozy initiative. It was 2007 or 8, and it was before Libya, and it was before Syria, and President Bashar Assad was present in this meeting. So we missed the opportunity. That's the message I want to send. Please, there was a question or statement there.
Donato Kiniger from the World Academy of Art and Science. You all depicted very well the state of play of international alliances from the governmental point of view. My question is, at a time when social media are driving politics and relations, what do you think is the future of transnational alliances among people rather than among nations? Do you see a future for that, somehow even bypassing the national borders in different ways?
Who is going to answer this question?
That's a very good question. I think we shouldn't preclude anything. Nobody has a crystal ball that is polished and clear. However, and actually these transnational, as you call them, alliances have been practiced before. We had people-to-people diplomacy. We had scientists for nuclear disarmament. We had all kinds of associations and alliances when there was a need. We even had the Women of Greenham Common in England. However, and it's an absolutely crucial element to have civil society a say. One of the most dysfunctional organs created by the UN member states is the 65-member Conference on Disarmament, which sits in Geneva, which is going to be marking its 40th anniversary today, this year. And for the last 22 years, more than half of its existence, it has not been able to agree on a program of work, let alone get something done. One of the reasons, not the main reason is different. The issues go to the national security core interests of countries. But one of the issues is that in the conference, there is absolutely no presence of civil society, unlike the Human Rights Council, where civil society, in a truncated way, obviously, as compared to member states, but still exists. Here it doesn't. However, and that said, and the importance noted of civil society, we cannot have, I don't think, we cannot have these transnational, professional or human collectives to create a second parallel lane in governance and in relationships. They should be there. They should be supporting, they should be augmenting the work of governments, but you cannot undermine the work of governments. You know, the Westphalian instinct is like cholesterol. There's good and bad cholesterol. The Westphalian terrible sort of instinct is what we're seeing now when countries are terribly egotistical. But the good aspect of it is that member states bear the primary responsibility for positive things on their territory, and undermining their territory, whether physically or philosophically, is not going to bring good results. Thank you.
I just want to comment on you. You're absolutely right. These are alliances signed by governments. That's true. But there exists, let's say, a global alliance of cities, and they have a point of view that, you know, the cities can rule the global affairs better than the countries. You know, this is absolutely different approach. But the second point is that having an internet access all over the world, this will not be an alliance. It will be an association of people, of like-minded people all over the world. And it's already going on, you know. And in small side, it's an echo chamber, and it's a bigger scale, it's a business relations. So many things are going to change, and maybe the governments will be playing an absolutely different role in the future. Any other questions? Yes, who is ready?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ismail.
I just wanted to ask a question, President Yushchenko. First of all, I must say that I have full sympathy with the feelings President Yushchenko has, because obviously what has happened in Ukraine is a bleeding wound for all Europe. I agree with that. And I can assure you that many people in Russia do not reject their personal responsibility for what has happened. My father, who was born in Kiev, was lucky to pass away before that all happened. But at the same time, I must say that maybe it's too early to start saying at each session, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Because, again, not taking responsibility from Russia, I don't think that she is the only responsible for what has happened. The roots are much deeper. We're living at a transitory phase with a totally hybrid international system. And this transition, this transformation has gone as a roller coaster on many countries and on many people. That's not justification. That's I'm trying to understand what has happened. And generally, I would say that we should maybe discuss that with more historical depth when we are talking about the reason why that happened. And finally, you mentioned several times the war. The term of war is very clear and legally binding. And I do not understand what gives you a possibility to call that a war while it has not been recognized as a war by Ukrainian authorities. Nobody has ever declared the war in Kiev. More than that, I think that maybe sometime it's worth also looking at what is happening at your porch. Because reading media in Ukraine, sometimes I'm getting more and more surprised when I learn facts about a relative of the Ukrainian president buying military equipment and weapons from Russia and selling it to the defense ministry or whatever in Ukraine. It's certainly a strange thing, and my question is very simple. If you consider that a war, and if you believe, and if it reflects the position of Ukraine people in Ukraine and the authorities why the status of war has never been declared. And final, let me say, comment. Many years ago, just after the Russia-Georgian conflict, I was in Tbilisi, just as a tourist with my family. I took all my family and we went, and I think it was somewhere in the year 2000 or 2010 or 2011. And there was an episode. Going by a taxi, we stopped and I decided to ask the directions because the driver lost his way. And it was the evening. There were 3 or 4 young guys sitting on the porch and drinking, having their beer. And when I came out and asked in Russian, this is exactly after the war, I asked them, could you tell me how to reach this spot? The answer was immediate. They stood up and asked me, and where are you coming from? I thought, okay, let it happen, whatever happens. I thought that. But I told them, from Moscow. Really? From Moscow itself? I said, yes, from Moscow. Oh, you should come more often. We do not have anything against Russian people. So my question, do you think it helps to cure the wound in Europe if you will be trying, continuing, deepening the threshold, building the walls, calling Russia Siberian civilization, as you said is one of your speeches, Russian people are slaves by nature. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I want to bring a totally different point, so I'll do so. In what we're talking about, we are really missing or at least, let's say, it was not sufficiently emphasized, that there is a whole new network that has been built up in the last 20 years or so with the enormous transformation of the supply chains of practically every company in the world, all the big companies. I mean, whatever Mr. Trump will say, Boeing has parts that are produced in China, in Eastern Europe, in everywhere. And this is true. The business communities have transformed the structures of production that used to be. And therefore, many of the treaty agreements where globalization was signed by the Westphalian states, shall we say, through negotiations that started with the Uruguay round and such other rounds, are no longer very relevant. When Apple produces its iPhones and other equipment in China, and the nationalistic structure that exists on the surface of it has been, I think, largely undermined by profound transformations of supply chains, production systems, and it's not just the biggest companies, it's everything from textiles that are sold in New York, coming from Bangladesh, and so on and so forth. So that part of it is a real alliance that is supported by enormous trillions and trillions of dollars every year. And therefore, it has more strength and validity than many of the other agreements, as was mentioned, for example, Union for the Mediterranean gets signed and so on, Barcelona product gets signed, but doesn't really produce much. That other stuff, undeclared, has transformed the world.
I will give the opportunity to President Yushchenko to answer.
I would like to answer. Yep. I need 40 minutes to answer. You know, based on the question you asked, it feels like there's an abysm, there's a gap between us. In 5 minutes that the chairman has given to me, I cannot step over this space. That should be a more substantial conversation for me to be able to convince you. But I will start with this. If you pick the Russian foreign policy for the last 350 years, or 300 years if you like, everywhere there will be a Ukrainian question there. And now, if Ukraine, not in the context of the Russian world, and from those initiatives, the neo-imperial initiatives that Putin has and comes with every year, if none of this is implemented, not the Eurasian Customs Union, without Ukrainian, that is not possible. Neither CIS Free Trade Union, neither Customs Union, nor CIS. Therefore, the Ukrainian presence is a critical element in the foreign policy. This is a challenge. If Ukraine is not in the orbit of the political interests and plans of the Russian Federation, that's the fiasco of these plans. Therefore, today, Russia carries out 28th war with Ukraine. Out of 6 sovereignty that we have declared last century, 3 were taken away from us via occupation by Russia. Russia took away our church from us, as you know very well. 171 times Russia has prohibited the use of Ukrainian language in our country. This list can go on and on and on until tens of basic fundamental principles, and therefore our position for the time being is this: we haven't made any political decision towards Russia where you would suspect the question of the territorial integrity or sovereignty, the political sovereignty of any Russian Federation unit. And when we talk about what has happened in Crimea, what happened in the Azov Sea in the east, I don't want to tell you the statistics on what is the army of Russia, what are the artillery and what are the military equipment that have been brought to the occupied area, but I can assure you that this material technical base in this area doesn't have any European military. It's not a joke. It is not a play whatsoever when we talk about the question of the occupation of Donbass or the occupation of Crimea, along with a number of other multiple questions, including the territorial integrity of Georgia. Dear friends, this is not a local or a domestic issue. Do not believe all these legends when in Russia somebody says that Ukrainians attacked Ukrainians in Donbass, or Georgians attacked Georgians, or Azerbaijanis attacked Azerbaijanis, and in Moldovans attacked Moldovans. We have in the east of Ukraine, in the Caucasus, in the Transnistria, we have geopolitical conflict where the policy of Russians' neo-imperial approach contradicts and opposes the European policy. Therefore, to conduct negotiation, and you know the Minsk OSCE group, Minsk group, we basically conduct negotiation with terroristic organization, and we know that very well that the author of the war is not Zakharchenko and not Plotnitsky. The author of the war is in Kremlin, but it's not the stakeholder of the negotiation. The armchair of the aggressor and oppressor is empty. It's not because we don't want to see any other format, just because this format is not accepted by the other part of the world, which includes Europe. Therefore, do not read the conflict in Ukraine or in Georgia as a local conflict. That is a major mistake of European and international perception. But I understand that we need to do a lot and to conduct many more dialogues to be able to understand the root cause and the reasons of those threats that Putin's Russia carry with itself. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, there will not be any more questions from the audience because they had to transform the hall for the evening, but I like the scenarios with the cycle scenario. So the President of Georgia started this discussion. He has the right to have the conclusion remarks.
Thank you, Valdis. Thank you a lot. And I want to continue by continuing what my friend and colleague, President Yushchenko, has summed up with. We have to be very sincere in evaluating what has been happening in Ukraine, what has been happening in Georgia. Sincere because I believe it determines the future alliances as well as the working alliances as well. Because what is alliance, and this has been mentioned before during today's discussions, alliance, be it a military alliance, NATO, or EU, or be it the Supreme Alliance, UN, it is the issue of trust and the issue of responsibility. And what we are facing in case of Ukraine and in case of Georgia, and what we have been trying as two presidents of occupied nations to reflect and share today with you, is that we have been undermined on the basics of what we are as independent and sovereign nations are entitled to. President Yushchenko mentioned 1994, where in the spirit of disarmament, a nation has committed its military, its nuclear arsenal to the spirit of disarmament. And the signatory nations signed that they would protect the sovereignty of Ukraine. We didn't have them stand so fast and so strongly when the nation was occupied and the Crimea was occupied. Georgia is also entitled to its sovereignty and territorial integrity. We are entitled to our commitments that we take. So when we are talking about those shortcomings, it's not only because it's the pain that is in our souls and in our hearts because of the people that have been murdered, killed, and tortured, our compatriots, but it's also because if we are not strong in our commitments for the alliances, then the alliances stop working. And these are the challenges that we have to take as members of the humankind, as members of the civilized world. And I completely support President's position that those cases should be discussed in a broader and more higher context than separate cases. The separate cases which are tragedies. I started today and I'll tell you, I'll finish with that. 2 days ago, they gave us a body of our compatriot which has been tortured on Russian military base and given back to Georgians. This is the emotions that our nations are living, and we want to share with you this, this pain that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all the panelists for vivid discussion. And on behalf of all the participants of this global forum, I will thank co-chairs of Nizami Ganjavi, Viti Freiberg and Ismail Sergaldin, especially Ravshan Muradov, who is the man who is behind all, we had all these 3 days. And I wish to everybody a good stay here in Baku, and see you next time, next year.